Thanks. Okay. Thank you, Ramzi. Our next discussant is Jeff Nugent.
No, that's
No, it's not.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
That's the phone. Okay, thank you. So I enjoyed these three papers, and I do think there's a lot of complementarity, as you've noticed, and in fact, I think there's more than what we've heard so far. Let me briefly, hopefully, if I push the wrong
Right
thing.
side, yes.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. So the basic on Kivanç's nice paper is this context that there's a central administration that's dependent on the provincial elite to collect taxes for the center's benefit. So the questions, as Ottoman power centralized under Mehmed II, why were tax rates lowered in the provinces, and yet the power of the landholders declined? And some earlier answers it has to do with Islamic legal system and collectivist cultural beliefs that are kind of constraints on this system. But his new answer is by controlling what the local landowners and tax collectors could collect from the peasants, that class's ability to accumulate wealth and entrepreneurship became limited, allowing the center to grow and to accumulate resources, getting a larger share of the revenues. He made, as we saw in the presentation this morning, demonstrations that the tax rates per peasant were higher in Western Europe than the Ottoman region, beginning in the 15th century, and that this was believed to have fallen relative to the earlier period, although there wasn't much evidence on that, and then that they did double or more in the 17th century. So this was this low 2 centuries of low taxes. He rejects, so in terms of the existing explanation, he rejects the so-called rational predator model of self-restraint on taxation on 2 grounds: that the assumptions are unrealistic, that that's a model that has a single control group, whereas it's just the government and the peasants. But here we have 2 groups. We have the central government, and then we have this elite groups in the rural areas that are the tax collectors. Secondly, that the predictions are invalid. The total collections would be increased by lowering the rate, the Laffer curve that we also saw this morning. The tax sector would invest and the economy grow. So it's saying that the results are kind of inconsistent with those explanations of that model. Oops, wrong one again. Yep. So it's a nice and skillfully written paper, actually very, very nicely written paper. It's dealing with a nice sweep of history, pre-Ottoman, Ottoman, classical, and then post-classical from the 17th century. Fascinating questions, and as I've mentioned, original answer. My questions. Were there really only 2 groups involved? It's because that's sort of crucial to that model and the explanation. I would have thought, I don't know, I'm not an expert on this history, but I would have thought that there's a potential for some splintering of the rural elites and competition among these rural elites, in which case then there would be at least 3 different parties, and that might be a source of another source explanation for the low taxation, because each of these groups might be anxious to get peasants if there's a shortage of peasants and so on. In each province, was the setup the same across the overall Ottoman Empire? And I sort of had doubts about that, and now just in Metin's paper we heard that there was variation and tax rates and so on across the region. So that, I think, needs some attention. Were the landowners or tax farmers, this, whether it's the Sapapi, what's the name of the Sapaki? I don't know whether this was universal through the system. What was the system? We weren't told in this paper, so this is where these papers are quite complementary. Would this apply to herdsmen and so on that are more mobile? So some groups in the society must be more mobile than the ones we're hearing about. Were the tax rates really so low if one takes into account the lower quality of land in the Middle East than in Western Europe? So that comparison, to me, is not entirely convincing. Just how did the center get its benefits from this low taxation? So if the taxes collected are low because of the low tax rates, this part about the commitments in terms of time, I think there was more of this in Kivanç's presentation than actually in the paper, at least, unless I missed it. But I think this, how the center really benefits from this low taxation needs to be further developed. Instead of encouraging, so on this part about, so if it was the case that the rural people are really discouraged from, that they don't really make much of any benefits from this lower taxation, how does the center benefit? And we understand that there could be less need for the rural armies and maintaining these cavalries, and then maybe more of the lower proceeds could go to the center. But really demonstration that that was the case, I think, could be developed. So if the center benefited so much, and certainly yesterday we heard a lot about Istanbul and how it was developing during a time of amazing development, growth of population, industry, traders, and so on. How were they fed? Was it not? Here we're told that there's not much, that the center constrained commerce in the countryside and discouraged markets. But how was the grains getting to these central areas? Now we're also told that the government gets its land for government farms, so the government became a producer and cash crops and so on. How did that happen? How did they get their land and start doing this? So how was this enforced? And I'll have to be very brief. How was this system? How good was this system of enforcing these low tax rates in the countryside and yet getting higher share of the proceeds to the center? Would there not be collusion between these fief holders, between these two branches that were said to be independent, the court system and this more administrative system? As I say, how are these people fed? So my final point is just a comment that another possible explanation. So I'm a development economist, so I like these sort of using development theory to explain things. So might there not be another story as to the low taxation and the development of the center, which would have to do with sort of two-sector growth model, wherein it might be that the terms of trade, we weren't really given evidence about the growth in grain production. It was said, our understanding that what was said was that there wasn't really much development. But could it not have been that what was really happening and responsible for the low taxes was not the decrees, but the fact that these prices fell? So that if this encouraged output to grow, but the terms of trade might have gone against these rural producers and benefiting the core and so on. So there's some, I make some references here to some literature along those in totally different contexts. So finally, my conclusion, this is a great paper. I learned a lot from it. Very appropriate to this interdisciplinary conference by drawing on interdependencies between economy and institutions, between institutions in different domains, and by making use of evidence from these different domains. Thank you very much.
Thank you,